Elena Voss froze at the top of the stone staircase, her hand pressed flat against the cold wall, her heart slamming against her ribs so hard she was sure the guards below could hear it. Through the half-open door of the West Tower study, she heard her husband's voice, low and urgent, speaking to someone who was not supposed to be inside the castle walls at this hour. "You should not have come here tonight," Damien Blackthorne said. "If anyone sees you in this wing, there will be questions I cannot answer." "Let them ask," a woman's voice replied, smooth and confident. "I am tired of hiding, Damien. Tired of pretending I am nothing to you." Elena's breath caught. She knew that voice. Everyone in the Blackthorne territory knew that voice. It belonged to Seraphine Ashgrove, the widow of General Cassian Ashgrove, the war hero who had died 6 months earlier defending the northern border. Seraphine had been given a private residence near the castle out of respect for her husband's sacrifice. She was not supposed to be inside the royal wing, and she was certainly not supposed to be alone with the Alpha King after midnight. Elena pressed herself closer to the wall, one hand moving instinctively to her stomach, where the twins she carried were still a secret she had been saving for the right moment. She had planned to tell Damien this week, after the peace summit with the Eastern Pax was finished. She had imagined his face lighting up, imagined him pulling her into his arms the way he used to during the early years of their marriage, standing in the dark hallway now, listening to him speak so gently to another woman. She felt that imagined moment crumble into dust. "Seraphine, we agreed," Damien said, and his voice had softened in a way Elena had not heard, directed at her in a very long time. "Not yet. Not while things are so fragile." "Fragile," Seraphine repeated, and there was something bitter in the word. "You mean while your wife is still here?" Elena did not wait to hear his answer. She turned and walked back down the staircase as quietly as she could manage, her legs shaking with every step, her mind refusing to accept what her ears had just told her. By the time she reached her own chambers, she was breathing hard, and she sat down on the edge of her bed and stared at the wall for a long time without moving. She told herself there had to be an explanation. Damien was not a man who broke his vows lightly. He had been raised on duty and honor, trained since childhood to put the pack before himself, and Elena had married him because she believed, foolishly perhaps, that a man who valued duty so highly would also value the vow he made to her in front of the entire Blackthorne court 3 years earlier. But duty and desire were different things, and Elena was beginning to understand, with a cold, sinking feeling, that Damien's heart might have wandered somewhere her own loyalty could never follow. The next morning, she watched him across the breakfast table, searching his face for some sign of guilt, some flicker of the conversation she had overheard. He looked the same as always, calm and composed, his dark eyes focused on the reports his beta had brought him. When he finally looked up and asked if she had slept well, his voice was perfectly ordinary, as though nothing in the world had changed. "I slept fine," she lied, and she watched him nod and return to his papers, and she wondered how many other lies had passed between them without either of them noticing. Over the following days, Elena began to see things she had somehow managed not to see before. The way Damien left meetings early, without explanation. The way certain guards exchanged glances when Seraphine's name came up in conversation. The way the castle staff, usually so open with their Luna, grew quiet and careful whenever she asked about the widow's visits to court. It was as though the entire pack had agreed to protect a secret from her, the one person who most deserved to know it. She tried, at first, to handle the situation with the grace her mother had taught her. She invited Seraphine to tea, hoping to read the truth in the other woman's eyes. Seraphine arrived dressed in mourning black that somehow still managed to look elegant, her golden hair pinned back, her expression polite and unreadable. They spoke of small things, of the harvest festival preparations, of the weather turning colder in the north. Not once did Seraphine mention Damien's name, and not once did she need to. Elena could feel the tension between them like a living thing, coiled and waiting. "You have been through so much," Elena said carefully, watching the widow's face. "Losing your husband the way you did. I cannot imagine the grief." Something flickered behind Seraphine's eyes, there and gone so quickly that Elena almost missed it. "Grief changes a person," Seraphine said. "It makes you realize how short life is, how foolish it is to deny yourself happiness when it is right in front of you." The words hung in the air between them, and Elena understood, in that moment, that Seraphine was not going to deny anything. She was simply going to let Elena draw her own conclusions and enjoy watching her do it. That night, Elena decided she could not carry the weight of suspicion alone any longer. She found Damien in his study, going over border patrol schedules with his beta, Ronan, a broad-shouldered man who had served the Blackthorn family since he was a boy. She waited until Ronan excused himself, and then she closed the door behind her and turned to face her husband. "I need to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to be honest with me." Damien set down his pen and looked at her, his expression unreadable in the candlelight. "Of course. Is there something happening between you and Seraphine Ashgrove?" For a moment, something crossed his face, so quick and so subtle that Elena might have imagined it if she had not been watching so closely. Then his features settled back into calm composure, and he shook his head slowly. "Seraphine lost her husband defending our territory," he said. "I have been trying to make sure she is properly cared for. That is all. Where is this coming from, Elena?" "I heard you," she said, her voice trembling now despite her best efforts to keep it steady. "2 nights ago, in the West Tower, I heard the two of you talking." Damien's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Elena thought she had finally cracked through his calm exterior. But then he sighed, the sigh of a man being unfairly accused, and shook his head again. "You misunderstood what you heard," he said. "I was discussing her late husband's pension with her. These matters require privacy, because they involve sensitive information about our treasury. I am sorry if that caused you concern, but I promise you, there is nothing to worry about." Elena wanted desperately to believe him. She searched his face for any sign of deception, but Damien had spent his entire life learning to keep his emotions hidden behind a mask of calm authority, and she found nothing there to hold on to, except her own doubt. "You are imagining things, Elena," he said gently, stepping closer and taking her hands in his. "The summit is putting stress on all of us. Perhaps you should rest more. Think of the health of our pack and of yourself." She let him hold her hands, let him kiss her forehead the way he used to when she was troubled, and she told herself that perhaps he was right. Perhaps the stress of the coming peace summit, combined with the exhaustion of early pregnancy, had made her imagination run wild. She wanted to believe it so badly that for a little while, she almost managed to convince herself. But doubt, once planted, does not simply disappear because a person wishes it away. It grows roots. It waits in the quiet moments, in the space between words, in the empty side of the bed when Damien claimed late meetings kept him from returning to their chambers before dawn. Elena found herself watching him more closely than ever, cataloging every small absence, every distracted glance, every moment his attention seemed to drift somewhere she could not follow. She had grown up believing that love, once earned, was something solid, something you could build a life upon without fear of it crumbling beneath you. Her own parents, Alpha Edmund Voss and his mate, had shared a bond so strong that even now, years into their marriage, they still looked at each other the way young lovers did. Elena had wanted that same certainty with Damien. When their families arranged the match between the Blackthorn and Voss pack lines, she had been nervous, but she had also been hopeful, and over the early years of their marriage, that hope had blossomed into something she believed was real affection, perhaps even love, on both sides. Now she was not so certain anymore. She thought of the twins growing inside her, innocent of all of this, and she felt a fierce protectiveness rise up through her fear. Whatever was happening between Damien and Seraphine, whatever truth he was hiding behind his calm reassurances, she would not let it touch her children. She would find out what was really going on, and she would protect herself and the babies she carried, no matter what it cost her. 3 days later, the pack gathered in the Great Hall, for a formal announcement Damien had called that morning, without explaining the reason to Elena beforehand. She sat beside him on the raised platform, her spine straight, her face composed into the practiced calm every Luna learned to wear in public, even as her stomach twisted with dread about what he might be planning to say. Damien rose to address the gathered pack, his voice carrying easily across the crowded hall. He spoke first of General Cassian Ashgrove's sacrifice, of the debt the entire Blackthorn territory owed to the fallen hero, who had given his life defending their borders. The pack murmured their agreement, heads nodding, some wolves lowering their eyes in respectful silence, for the memory of a man they had genuinely admired. Then Damien turned toward where Seraphine stood near the front of the gathering, dressed once again in elegant black, and he extended his hand toward her in a gesture that made Elena's chest go tight with alarm. "In honor of General Ashgrove's service," Damien announced, "and in recognition of the sacrifice his family has made for this pack, I am granting Seraphine Ashgrove a permanent place within these walls, under the full protection of the Blackthorn Crown, for as long as she wishes to remain." A ripple of surprise moved through the hall. Such honors were not unheard of for the families of fallen warriors, but the wording, the permanence of it, the way Damien's eyes lingered on Seraphine as he spoke, told a story that went far beyond gratitude. Elena felt every eye in the room shift subtly toward her, watching to see how the Luna would react to her husband so publicly elevating another woman's place at court. She kept her face still. She had learned, over 3 years as Luna, how to hide her feelings behind a serene mask, and she called on every ounce of that training now. But inside, something that had been holding on by threads finally, quietly, gave way. That evening, alone in her chambers, Elena sat by the window and watched the moon rise over the Blackthorn forest, and she made a decision that would change everything. She would tell Damien about the twins, as she had originally planned, but not because she hoped it would fix what was broken between them. She needed to know, once and for all, what kind of man he truly was, whether the father of her children was someone who would fight to protect his family, or someone who had already begun walking away from it in his heart. She found him in his study late that night, alone, staring at a letter she could not read from where she stood in the doorway. He looked up when she entered, and something in her expression must have told him this was not an ordinary visit, because he set the letter aside immediately and gave her his full attention. "Elena," he said, "what is it?" She crossed the room and stood before him, her hands folded protectively over her stomach, and she said the words she had been carrying inside her for weeks. "I am carrying our children, Damien. Twins." For a long moment he said nothing at all. She watched his face, desperate for the joy she had once imagined seeing there, desperate for some sign that the man she had married still existed beneath the layers of duty and distance that had grown between them. But what crossed his features instead was something closer to alarm, quickly followed by a flicker of something that looked almost like resentment, gone so fast she might have imagined it. "Twins," he repeated quietly. "Now, of all times. That is all you have to say?" Elena's voice cracked slightly, betraying the hope she had been trying so hard to hide. Damien rubbed a hand across his face, and when he spoke again, his voice had an edge to it she had never heard him use with her before. "Do you understand what is happening right now, Elena? The summit, the tension with the Eastern Pax, everything I am trying to hold together. And now you tell me this. I am not telling you this to make things difficult for you," she said, hurt and anger rising together inside her chest. "I am telling you because you are their father, and I thought, foolishly it seems, that you would want to know." "Of course I want to know," he said, but the words came out flat, unconvincing, the words of a man saying what he was supposed to say, rather than what he felt. "I am simply overwhelmed. That is all." Elena studied his face for a long moment, searching for the man she had married, and found only a stranger wearing his features. She thought of the West Tower, of the tenderness in his voice when he spoke to Seraphine, of the way he had looked at another woman, with more warmth than he had shown his own wife in months. And she understood, with a clarity that felt like ice water running through her veins, that whatever they had once shared, Damien's heart had already moved somewhere she could not follow. "I see," she said quietly, and she turned and walked out of the study without another word, leaving him standing alone amid his papers and his secrets. And for the first time since she had overheard that conversation in the West Tower, Elena felt something other than fear settle over her. It was resolve, cold and clear, and it would carry her through everything that was still to come. Elena did not sleep that night. She sat awake in the dark, replaying every moment of her marriage from the very beginning, searching for the point where things had started to unravel. She thought of her wedding day, 3 years earlier, when Damien had looked at her with what she believed was genuine warmth, as their families joined the Blackthorn and Voss pack lines together. She thought of the early months, when he would leave notes for her in the garden, when he would return from long patrols just to see her smile, before falling asleep beside her. Somewhere between then and now, something had shifted, and Elena needed to understand what. She began quietly asking questions among the staff she trusted most, careful not to reveal how much she already suspected. It was an older maid named Ivy, a woman who had served the Blackthorn household since before Damien was born, who finally gave her the truth she had been searching for. Seraphine and the king grew up together, Ivy said one afternoon, her voice low, as she folded linens in Elena's private sitting room. Before you came to us, my lady, before the marriage was arranged, they were close as children, closer still as they grew older. Everyone assumed they would be mated one day. Elena's hands went still over the embroidery she had been pretending to work on. What happened? Politics happened, Ivy said simply. The old king wanted an alliance with the Voss pack line, not a match built on childhood affection. Seraphine's family did not have the standing the crown needed at the time, so the match with you was arranged instead, and Seraphine married General Ashgrove not long after, though many said at the time it was more a marriage of convenience than of love. The pieces fell into place with a sickening clarity. Elena understood now why Damien's eyes had softened so completely when he spoke to Seraphine in the West Tower, why his voice had carried a tenderness she had never once heard, directed toward herself. It was not new affection blooming between them. It was old affection, buried, but never truly gone, resurfacing now that circumstance had finally cleared the path between them. General Ashgrove's death had removed the one obstacle still standing in their way, and Elena realized with growing horror that she herself was the only obstacle that remained. Does everyone know this? Elena asked quietly. Ivy's expression grew apologetic. Most of the older members of court remember, my lady. It is not something anyone speaks of openly, out of respect for you. But yes, many of us have watched the way things have changed since the widow returned to court, and we have wondered when you would notice. Elena felt a fresh wave of humiliation wash over her. She had been the last to know, the only person at court still clinging to the belief that her marriage was something solid, while everyone around her had quietly watched the truth unfold and said nothing. She thanked Ivy for her honesty, and after the maid left, she allowed herself exactly 10 minutes to grieve for the marriage she had believed in, before she straightened her spine and decided that grief would have to wait. She had children to protect now, and self-pity was a luxury she could not afford. Over the following weeks, Elena watched the changes at court accelerate. Seraphine began attending council meetings that had never before included non-family members, offering opinions on matters of pack governance, as though she had every right to speak on them. Damien never corrected her, never reminded the council that Seraphine held no official position that warranted such involvement. Instead, he listened to her with the kind of attentive respect he had once reserved only for his most senior advisors. The council itself began to shift its treatment of Elena, subtly at first, in ways she might have dismissed as coincidence if there had not been so many of them. Meetings she had always been included in now happened without her knowledge. Decisions about the upcoming peace summit, decisions that would once have required her input as Luna, were made and finalized before she even learned they were being discussed. When she asked Damien about it, he offered the same gentle, condescending reassurance he always did. You should be resting, he told her, one hand on her shoulder, in a gesture that might have looked affectionate to anyone watching, but which Elena now recognized as a way of steering her away from involvement rather than toward comfort. The pregnancy is demanding enough without the added stress of politics. Let me handle these matters, trust me. Trust had once come easily to Elena. Now every reassurance from her husband felt like another brick in a wall being built between herself and the truth of what was happening in her own home. She began to feel like a ghost within the castle she had called home for 3 years, present in body, but increasingly absent from every decision that mattered, while Seraphine's shadow grew longer across every corner of Blackthorn Court. It was Ronan, of all people, who first showed Elena genuine concern. The broad-shouldered beta had served Damien loyally since childhood, and Elena had always assumed his loyalty to the king would outweigh any sympathy he might feel for her. But one evening, as she walked alone through the castle gardens trying to clear her head, she found him standing near the fountain, watching her approach with an expression she could not quite read. "My lady," he said, inclining his head respectfully. "You should not be out here alone after dark. It is not safe, especially now." "Especially now," Elena repeated, catching something careful in the way he had phrased it. Ronan hesitated, glancing back toward the castle, as though checking whether anyone might overhear them. "There are rumors moving through the pack, my lady, about tension building along our borders. Rival packs sense that things are unsettled here, and unsettled packs make tempting targets. I would feel better knowing you have guards with you at all times, particularly given your condition. Elena studied his face carefully. Ronan, I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer. You have served the Blackthorn family your whole life. You know things about this court that I do not. Is there something happening between the king and Seraphine Ashgrove? For a long moment, Ronan said nothing, his jaw tight, clearly caught between loyalty to his king and whatever sense of honor made him hesitate now. Finally, he spoke, choosing his words with obvious care. I cannot speak to matters of the king's heart, my lady. That is not my place. But I can tell you this. I have served this family long enough to see patterns repeat themselves, and I do not like the pattern I am watching unfold now. Please, protect yourself, and protect your children. It was not the confirmation Elena had asked for, but it was confirmation enough. She thanked him and walked back to her chambers with a heavier heart than she had carried in weeks, understanding now that even those loyal to Damien could see what was happening, and that their silence, however well-intentioned, was its own kind of complicity. That night, lying awake beside a husband who had returned to their bed later and later each week, always with some explanation about council business or border reports, Elena began to plan, not out of anger, though anger simmered beneath everything she felt now, but out of necessity. She would not raise her children in a home built on lies and quiet humiliation. She would not spend the rest of her life waiting for a man to choose her, when every sign around her suggested he had already chosen someone else, in every way that mattered except the formal one. She began, quietly and carefully, reaching out to contacts within her own bloodline. Her father, Alpha Edmund Voss, led the Duskwood Pack, a proud and independent territory that had never fully reconciled itself to the dominance the Blackthorn crown held over the region. Elena had grown up hearing stories of old tensions between the two packs, tensions her marriage to Damien had been meant to ease. She had not spoken to her father as often as she should have over the past 3 years, caught up in the demands of life as Luna, but she remembered enough of him to know that if she came to him now, carrying his grandchildren and fleeing a husband who had betrayed her, he would not turn her away. She began, in small and careful ways, preparing for a departure she had not yet told anyone about, not even the guards she trusted most. She set aside personal funds Damien did not know about, remnants of her own family inheritance that had never been fully absorbed into the Blackthorn treasury. She spoke quietly with 2 guards from her personal escort, women named Freya and Marisol, who had served her since her wedding day, and whose loyalty she trusted above almost anyone else at court. She did not tell them everything at first, only that she might need their help with something important in the near future, and both women had agreed without hesitation, the kind of immediate loyalty that told Elena she had chosen well. Meanwhile, at court, the situation grew steadily worse. Seraphine's presence became so constant that servants began referring to her, in hushed voices, by titles that were not hers to claim. Elena overheard, more than once, whispers comparing her to the widow, wondering aloud whether the crown might soon see a change in its Luna. She said nothing when she heard these whispers, kept her composure in every public setting, but each comment landed like a small wound, and the wounds were beginning to accumulate into something Elena could no longer simply absorb and set aside. The final weeks before the peace summit brought the tension to a breaking point. Damien grew more distracted than ever, disappearing for hours at a time, with no explanation Elena could verify. She saw him and Seraphine together on more than one occasion, walking through the castle gardens deep in conversation, their heads bent close together, in a way that spoke of an intimacy no political discussion required. She watched, from a distance, unwilling to confront him again, only to be told once more that she was imagining things, that her condition was making her paranoid, that she needed rest rather than answers. She had learned, by now, that confrontation only earned her more careful lies. So instead, she watched, and she waited, and she prepared, and she carried the growing weight of her twins, alongside the growing certainty that the life she had built at Blackthorn was ending, whether she was ready for it or not. The only question left was how it would end, and Elena intended to make certain that when it did, she would be the one who decided the terms. The peace summit arrived on a cold morning, with delegations from the eastern packs traveling through the mountain passes to gather at Blackthorn Castle for 3 days of negotiation that would determine the future of trade routes and border rights across half the northern territories. Elena, despite everything happening in her private life, still carried her official duties as Luna, and she stood beside Damien in the great hall, as he welcomed the arriving delegates with the composed authority that had always made him an effective leader, whatever failures he carried as a husband. It was during the welcoming feast that first evening that everything Elena had feared finally came into the open, in front of the entire gathered court and the visiting delegations from 3 rival packs. The feast had been progressing normally enough, with formal toasts and careful diplomatic conversation, when Damien rose to address the hall, ostensibly to thank the visiting delegates for their journey. But partway through his remarks, his attention shifted, and he turned toward where Seraphine sat near the high table, dressed in deep green silk that made her golden hair seem to glow in the candlelight. "Before we continue," Damien said, "I would like to take a moment to honor someone who has shown remarkable strength through unimaginable loss." He gestured toward Seraphine, and the hall's attention followed his hand. Seraphine Ashgrove lost her husband, defending the very borders we discuss the future of tonight. Her grace through grief has been an example to us all, and I have decided that going forward, she will serve as my personal advisor on matters concerning the families of our fallen warriors, with full access to court and counsel. A murmur moved through the hall, and Elena felt every eye shift toward her, watching for her reaction, with the kind of hungry curiosity that court gossip always carried. She kept her face carefully composed, but inside, something cold and final settled over her heart. This was not simply a private betrayal anymore. Damien had just elevated Seraphine's position in front of visiting delegations from rival packs, formalizing an influence that had no precedent and no genuine justification beyond whatever feelings he could not bring himself to hide any longer. One of the visiting delegates, an older wolf from the Eastern Ironvale pack, leaned toward his companion and murmured something Elena could not quite hear, though she caught the tone of it easily enough, the amused, knowing tone of someone witnessing a scandal unfold in real time. She felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, but she held herself perfectly still, refusing to give the gathered crowd the satisfaction of watching her crumble. Seraphine, for her part, rose gracefully, and offered a small, gracious bow toward Damien, her expression a masterwork of modest surprise, as though she had not known this announcement was coming, though Elena suspected strongly that she had helped orchestrate every word of it. "I am honored, my king," Seraphine said, her voice carrying easily across the now silent hall. "I will serve however I am needed. However I am needed." The phrase hung in the air, and Elena understood, with a clarity sharp enough to cut, that Seraphine intended to be needed in every way a woman could be needed by a king, and that Damien, whether through guilt over the general's death or through feelings that had never truly faded since their youth, seemed entirely willing to let her. Elena excused herself from the feast shortly after, citing exhaustion from her pregnancy, and no one questioned the excuse, though she caught more than a few sympathetic glances from wolves in the crowd who understood exactly what they had just witnessed. She walked back to her chambers with her spine straight and her chin high, and only once the door closed behind her did she allow herself to sink onto the edge of her bed and let the tears finally fall, tears she had been holding back for weeks. She cried for the marriage she had believed in, for the man she thought she had married, for the humiliation of being publicly overshadowed by another woman in front of delegations who would carry the story back to their own territories within days. She cried for her children, who did not deserve to be born into a household so thoroughly poisoned by betrayal and quiet cruelty. And when the tears finally stopped, something inside her had hardened into a resolve she would not allow herself to abandon again. Freya found her an hour later, having come to check on her Luna after noticing she had left the feast early. Elena looked up at her loyal guard, her eyes still red, but her voice steady, and she said the words that would set everything in motion. "It is time," Elena said. "I need you and Marisol to help me leave this place, quietly, before the summit ends. Can I trust you both to keep this secret until we are ready?" Freya did not hesitate. She knelt beside Elena's bed and took her hand, her expression fierce with a loyalty that had nothing to do with politics, and everything to do with genuine care for the woman she had protected for 3 years. "You can trust us with your life, my lady. Tell us what you need, and we will make it happen." Over the following 2 days, while the peace summit continued its formal negotiations in the Great Hall, Elena moved quietly behind the scenes, preparing everything she would need for a departure that had to remain completely secret until the moment she was ready to act. She could not risk word reaching Damien or his council before she was safely away, not while she carried children whose safety depended entirely on a clean and unchallenged exit. She wrote letters, carefully worded, to be delivered only after her departure, one for her father, explaining what had happened and asking for sanctuary. One for Damien, though she rewrote it more times than she could count, struggling to find words that conveyed the full weight of her heartbreak without descending into the kind of raw accusation that would only give him ammunition to paint her as unstable or unreasonable when the story inevitably spread. She wanted her departure to be understood as what it truly was, a woman protecting herself and her children from a marriage that had become a cage, not the dramatic overreaction of a jealous wife imagining threats that were not real. She also began, carefully, gathering allies she had not previously considered. Elder Mira, one of the oldest and most respected members of the Blackthorn Council, had always shown Elena quiet kindness during her years at court, and Elena suspected the elder woman saw exactly what was happening between Damien and Seraphine, even if propriety kept her from speaking of it openly. Elena visited her privately on the second night of the summit, and though she did not reveal her full plan, she asked the elder a question that mattered more than anything else. If Aluna were to leave this court, Elena asked carefully, carrying the rightful heirs of the Blackthorn bloodline, would the pack still recognize those children's claim, even if their mother chose to raise them elsewhere? Elder Mira studied her for a long moment, her ancient eyes missing nothing, and when she finally answered, her voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. Bloodline is bloodline, my dear. No political maneuvering, no matter how clever, can erase the claim of children born to a king and his rightful Luna. Whatever choice you are considering, know that your children's place in this pack's future cannot be taken from them, wherever you choose to raise them. The answer gave Elena the final piece of confidence she needed. Whatever happened between herself and Damien, whatever humiliation or heartbreak she carried away from this marriage, her children's future was protected by bloodline itself, a truth no amount of favor shown to Seraphine could undo. She thanked the elder and returned to her chambers to finish her preparations, feeling, for the first time in weeks, something close to peace settling over the storm still raging inside her. On the final night of the Peace Summit, as the delegates gathered for the closing feast that would mark the successful conclusion of 3 days of negotiation, Elena stood once more beside her husband, playing the role of gracious Luna for what she knew, with quiet certainty, would be the last time she ever needed to play it. She watched Damien accept praise from the visiting delegates for the successful summit, watched Seraphine hover nearby throughout the evening in a position of prominence that would have been unthinkable for anyone outside the royal family only months earlier, and she felt nothing but a strange, calm detachment, as though she were already watching the scene from somewhere far away. When the feast finally ended and the castle settled into the quiet hours before dawn, Elena returned to her chambers one last time, changed into traveling clothes she had hidden away for this exact night, and waited for the signal from Freya that would tell her everything was ready. She looked around the room that had been her home for 3 years, at the furniture she had chosen, the paintings she had commissioned, the small personal touches that had once made this cold castle feel like something close to a home. She felt no sadness at leaving it behind. Whatever love had once lived within these walls had already died weeks ago, in a hallway outside the West Tower, and everything since then had simply been the slow process of Elena finally accepting the truth. A soft knock came at her door just past midnight. She opened it to find Freya and Marisol waiting, both dressed for travel, both carrying the small bags of supplies Elena had asked them to prepare. Behind them stood 2 more guards from her personal escort, wolves who had served her loyally, and who had agreed, without hesitation, to help their Luna leave the court that no longer valued her. "Everything is ready, my lady," Freya said quietly. "The horses are waiting at the eastern gate. The night guard there owes his position to your father's recommendation years ago. He will let us pass without question." Elena looked back once more at the room behind her, then turned and walked out into the corridor, her hand resting protectively over her stomach, where her children slept unaware that tonight, their mother was about to walk away from everything she had once believed her life would be, and toward a future she would have to build entirely on her own strength. The eastern gate stood quiet in the deep hours before dawn, its usual complement of guards reduced to a single night watchman named Corin, a young wolf who had grown up on Voss lands before his family moved north to serve the Blackthorn crown. He recognized Elena immediately despite her traveling cloak, and though surprise flickered across his face at finding his Luna preparing to leave the castle grounds at such an hour with an armed escort, he asked no questions. He simply opened the gate and offered a respectful bow as she passed, murmuring a quiet wish for safe travels that Elena would remember gratefully for a long time afterward. The journey to Duskwood territory would take the better part of 2 days on horseback, moving carefully through forest paths that avoided the main roads where word of a traveling party might reach curious ears before Elena wanted it to. Freya rode close beside her, watching for any sign of fatigue or distress, while Marisol and the 2 additional guards, wolves named Peregrine and Talia, kept careful watch on the surrounding forest for any threat, whether from rival packs sensing weakness or from Blackthorn riders sent to bring their Luna back once her absence was discovered. Elena had chosen to leave a letter for Damien, sealed and left on the desk in his study, where he would find it once he realized she was gone. She had spent hours crafting the words, wanting them to convey not desperate heartbreak but calm, clear resolve, the words of a woman who had made a considered decision, rather than fled in a moment of emotional weakness. She had written that she was taking their children to safety, that she would not raise them in a household built on lies and humiliation, and that if Damien ever wished to know his children, he would need to earn that privilege through honest acknowledgement of what he had done, not through the authority his crown gave him to simply demand her return. She did not know, as she rode north through the cold morning air, exactly when her absence would be discovered, or how Damien would react when he found her letter. Part of her expected fury, the fury of a proud king humiliated by his wife's public departure. Another part of her, the part that still remembered the man she had fallen in love with during their early years together, wondered if somewhere beneath his recent coldness, there might still be enough feeling left for him to feel genuine grief at what he had lost. She pushed that thought away as often as it arose. She could not afford, right now, to hope for a version of Damien who might not exist anymore. They stopped only briefly to rest the horses and allow Elena moments to recover from the physical strain of travel while carrying twins, moments that Freya insisted upon despite Elena's protests that they needed to keep moving. "Your children's safety depends on your own strength holding," Freya told her firmly during one such stop, pressing a water skin into Elena's hands. "We will reach Duskwood in time. There is no benefit to arriving exhausted and unwell." Elena accepted the wisdom in her guard's words, though impatience gnawed at her the entire journey, a fear that lingered at the edge of every quiet moment that somehow, despite all their careful planning, Damien would discover her departure too soon and send riders fast enough to catch them before they crossed into Duskwood territory, where Blackthorn authority held no legal claim. That fear proved unfounded, at least for the duration of the journey itself. They crossed the boundary marker into Duskwood lands on the afternoon of the second day, a simple carved stone half hidden among the trees that Elena remembered from childhood visits to her father's territory. The moment they passed it, she felt something in her chest loosen slightly, the first easing of tension she had allowed herself since the night she had overheard Damien and Seraphine in the West Tower weeks earlier. Word of their arrival reached the Duskwood packhouse before they did, carried ahead by scouts who patrolled the borders and recognized the Voss crest on Freya's traveling cloak. By the time Elena's small party rode into the central grounds of the packhouse where she had spent her childhood, her father was already waiting on the front steps, flanked by 2 of his senior betas, his expression a complicated mixture of surprise, concern, and the particular fierce protectiveness that had always defined him as both a father and an alpha. Alpha Edmund Voss was a tall man, broad through the shoulders in the way of wolves who had spent decades leading through both diplomacy and, when necessary, through strength, his dark hair now streaked with gray at the temples in a way that only added to the quiet authority he carried. He came down the steps himself rather than waiting for his daughter to approach him, and when Elena slid down from her horse, exhaustion finally catching up with her all at once, he caught her in his arms before she could even fully find her footing. "Elena," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to show openly. "What has happened? Why are you here, and not at Blackthorn?" She told him everything, standing there in the central courtyard of her childhood home, too exhausted and too overwhelmed to wait for a more private setting. She told him about the West Tower, about Seraphine, about the public elevation at the Peace Summit feast, about the twins she carried, and the future she refused to let be shadowed by her husband's betrayal. Her father listened without interrupting, his jaw growing tighter with every detail, his hands tightening protectively on her shoulders. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring out toward the forest that separated Duskwood territory from Blackthorn lands, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the kind of controlled fury that Elena remembered from childhood, the voice he used when discussing threats to the pack he had sworn to protect. "You will stay here," he said, "for as long as you need, for as long as you wish. This is your home, Elena, and it always has been, whatever vows you made elsewhere. And your children, when they are born, will be protected by this pack, as though they were born to it directly." "Father, I don't want to bring conflict between our territories," Elena said, some part of her still worried about the political consequences of her decision, even now. Damien may not simply let this go quietly. Edmund's expression hardened further. "Let him come then, if he wishes to discuss the matter, but he will discuss it on Duskwood terms now, not Blackthorn ones. You are under my protection here, and no king, however powerful, has the right to demand you return to a household where you were treated with such disrespect." Elena felt tears prick at her eyes again, though this time they were tears of relief rather than grief, the first moment of genuine safety she had felt in what seemed like months. Her father guided her inside, calling for the pack healer to examine her and the twins after 2 days of hard travel, and for the first time since that terrible night in the West Tower, Elena allowed herself to simply rest, surrounded by people who had never once made her question whether she belonged. The following days brought a strange kind of peace to Duskwood territory, even as word of Elena's departure inevitably began spreading through the wider region, carried by traveling merchants and messenger wolves who moved between the various pack territories on their usual business. Elena's mother, Alpha Edmund's mate Corinne, arrived within days of hearing the news, having been away visiting distant relatives when Elena first arrived, and the reunion between mother and daughter was one of the few moments in recent memory that Elena allowed herself to simply feel joy without complication. Corinne, a gentle but steel-willed woman who had raised Elena to value her own worth long before any marriage arrangement entered the picture, held her daughter close and murmured words of comfort that Elena had not realized how badly she needed to hear. "You did not fail your marriage, Elena," her mother told her firmly. "Your husband failed it, and failed you, and you were wise enough and strong enough to protect yourself and your children, rather than staying somewhere you were no longer valued. That is not weakness. That is exactly the kind of strength I raised you to have." Elena settled, over the following weeks, into a rhythm of life at Duskwood that felt both familiar and entirely new. She had grown up within these walls, but she returned to them now as a different woman than the girl who had left to marry Damien 3 years earlier, carrying children of her own and a hard-won understanding of exactly what she deserved from any partnership she chose to build in the future, whether that partnership ever included Damien again or not. Meanwhile, back at Blackthorn Castle, the discovery of Elena's departure had set off exactly the kind of political crisis Elena had anticipated, though the shape it took surprised even her once reports began filtering north through the network of contacts her father maintained across the region. Damien discovered Elena's letter the morning after her departure, when he returned to his study expecting to find her waiting, with questions about the summit's final arrangements, as she often did the morning after important gatherings. Instead, he found only silence, and a sealed letter resting on his desk bearing his name, written in Elena's careful handwriting. He read it standing up, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief, to something that Ronan, who happened to be present delivering morning reports, would later describe to the council as genuine shock, the kind of shock a man feels when a certainty he never questioned suddenly collapses beneath him. Damien read the letter twice, then a third time, his hands tightening on the parchment until his knuckles went pale. "Find out when she left," he said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "Find out who helped her, and find out where she has gone." It did not take long to piece together the answer. The night watchman at the eastern gate, Corin, was questioned within the hour, and though he was reluctant to betray his Luna's trust, he eventually admitted to allowing her party to pass in the middle of the night. Combined with the absence of Freya, Marisol, and 2 other guards from Elena's personal escort, along with reports from a Blackthorn scout who had noticed unfamiliar travel patterns near the northern forest paths, It did not take Damien's counsel long to conclude that Elena had traveled toward Duskwood territory, seeking refuge with her father. The council chamber that afternoon crackled with tension, unlike anything it had experienced in years. Elder Mira sat near the front, her expression carefully neutral, though Elena's earlier conversation with her meant she alone among the council understood exactly why the Luna had chosen to leave. The other council members, less informed, reacted with a mixture of alarm and barely disguised judgment. Some directed at Elena for what they saw as a dramatic and destabilizing decision. Others, more perceptively, directed at Damien himself. "This is a political disaster," one older council member said bluntly. "The Luna fleeing to her father's territory, carrying the crown's heirs, days after a peace summit, where 3 rival delegations witnessed tension at this very court. This will be discussed across every pact territory within the week. The children she carries," another added, "are the rightful heirs to the Blackthorn bloodline. If she raises them at Duskwood, outside our direct influence, it creates an unprecedented succession question that our enemies will exploit without hesitation." Damien sat through the discussion with a stone-faced expression that gave away little of what he actually felt, though those who knew him best, particularly Ronan, recognized the particular stillness that meant the king was barely containing something dangerous beneath his composed exterior. When he finally spoke, his voice was controlled but carried an edge that silenced the room immediately. "I understand the political implications," he said. "I am well aware of them without the council reminding me. What I need now is not commentary on the disaster, but solutions for addressing it." It was Elder Mira who finally spoke the question no one else seemed willing to voice directly. "My king, before we discuss solutions, perhaps we should discuss causes. The Luna did not leave without reason. Perhaps understanding why she felt she needed to flee would serve us better than simply focusing on how to bring her back." Damien's jaw tightened at the elder's words, and for a moment, something like guilt flickered across his features before he mastered it back into careful neutrality. "This is not the venue for that discussion," he said, and the finality in his voice closed the topic, though Elena Mira's pointed gaze lingered on him a moment longer than was entirely comfortable, a silent acknowledgement that she, at least, understood exactly what causes the king was so reluctant to discuss. In the days that followed, the political consequences Elena had feared began unfolding exactly as the council had predicted. Word of the Luna's departure spread quickly through the region, carried by the same travelers and messengers who had witnessed the summit feast where Seraphine's elevation had been announced so publicly. Rival pact territories, sensing instability at the heart of Blackthorn power, began testing the borders in small but deliberate ways. Scouts crossing into disputed territories that had remained peacefully uncontested for years. Minor trade disputes suddenly escalating into tense standoffs that would have been resolved quietly under normal circumstances. The Ironvale Pack, whose delegate had witnessed the feast announcement firsthand, sent a formal inquiry, questioning whether the succession of the Blackthorn crown remained secure, given the reported departure of the Luna and her unborn heirs. It was a diplomatically worded letter, but the implicit threat beneath its careful language was unmistakable to everyone who read it. A pack whose own succession appeared unstable was a pack vulnerable to challenge, and Ironvale, along with several other territories, seemed eager to explore exactly how vulnerable Blackthorn had become. Damien found himself, for the first time in his reign, genuinely uncertain how to proceed. He had built his entire identity around control, around the calm competence that had made him an effective Alpha King since inheriting the crown from his father. Elena's departure had shattered that control in a way nothing else ever had, and the political fallout compounding around him made it impossible to simply retreat into denial or distraction the way he had during the weeks leading up to her departure. It was during this period of mounting crisis that Seraphine's true nature began, slowly, to reveal itself to those paying close attention. Rather than stepping back from her newly elevated position, given the scandal now surrounding it, she leaned further into her influence, offering Damien counsel on how to manage the succession crisis in ways that, Ronan noticed with growing unease, seemed to consistently benefit her own position at court, while doing little to actually address the underlying problem of Elena's absence. "You should focus on stability now, not on chasing after a Luna who chose to leave," Seraphine told Damien, during one private conversation that Ronan happened to overhear from the adjoining corridor, close enough to catch the words clearly. The pack needs to see strength and continuity from its king, not a man pursuing a wife who has already made her choice clear. She is carrying my children, Damien said, and there was something raw in his voice that Ronan had not heard from his king in a very long time. I cannot simply let that go, Seraphine, whatever else is happening. Of course not, Seraphine agreed smoothly, though something in her tone made Ronan's instincts prickle with suspicion. But there are ways to secure your claim to those children, without necessarily needing Elena's cooperation. The bloodline is what matters for succession, not the mother's continued presence at court. Ronan withdrew from the corridor before he could hear more, disturbed by what he had overheard, though he was not yet certain what to make of it. Something about the exchange troubled him deeply, a sense that Seraphine's counsel, however reasonable it might sound on the surface, was steering Damien away from reconciliation and toward a colder, more transactional approach to his own children's future, one that would conveniently keep Seraphine's own position secure, regardless of what happened between Damien and Elena. Over the following days, Ronan began paying closer attention to Seraphine's movements and conversations, motivated by a growing unease he could not quite name but felt compelled to investigate. What he discovered, piece by careful piece, painted a picture far more calculated than anyone at court had suspected. Seraphine had been in quiet contact with several council members even before General Ashgrove's death, cultivating relationships and favors that had positioned her perfectly to step into influence the moment circumstances allowed. Her grief, genuine as it might have been in its own way, had not stopped her from recognizing and seizing the opportunity General Ashgrove's death had created, an opportunity to finally claim the position with Damien that political circumstance had denied her years earlier. Ronan brought his concerns to Elder Mira first, uncertain whether Damien, in his current state of guilt and confusion, would be receptive to hearing anything that complicated his understanding of Seraphine's role in the unfolding crisis. Elder Mira listened carefully to everything Ronan had observed, her expression growing graver with each detail. And when he finished, she nodded slowly, as though confirming suspicions she had already begun forming on her own. This confirms what I have long feared, Elder Mira said. Seraphine Ashgrove has been playing a longer game than any of us initially understood. The question now is whether the king can be made to see it before more damage is done, or whether his guilt over Elena's departure has made him too vulnerable to her influence to hear the truth. Someone needs to tell him, Ronan said. Someone will, Elder Mira replied. But it must be handled carefully, Ronan. A king confronted with evidence that he has been manipulated is a dangerous thing, capable of denial as easily as acceptance. We must be certain of our evidence, and certain of our timing, before we risk everything on a single conversation. That evening, as Damien sat alone in his study, long after the rest of the castle had gone quiet, staring at nothing in particular, while the weight of everything happening around him pressed down harder than he was willing to admit, even to himself, he found himself thinking, unexpectedly, of a small detail from years ago. A memory of Elena, early in their marriage, laughing at something he had said during a quiet dinner, her whole face lighting up in a way that had made him feel, for just a moment, like the luckiest man in the Northern Territories. He had not thought of that memory in a very long time, buried as it had been beneath years of duty and distraction, and the slow, creeping return of old feelings for someone he had once believed he would never have the chance to love. For the first time since Elena's departure, Damien allowed himself to wonder whether he had made a catastrophic mistake, not simply in how he had handled Seraphine's return to court, but in how thoroughly he had failed to recognize what he was losing, while he was still able to prevent losing it. Weeks passed at Duskwood territory, and Elena found herself slowly rebuilding a sense of self that had been steadily eroded over the final months of her marriage. Freed from the constant vigilance required to navigate Blackthorn court politics, freed from the exhausting effort of pretending not to notice what everyone around her could see clearly, she began to remember who she had been before duty, and disappointment had worn her down. Her father involved her, cautiously at first and then with growing trust, in matters of Duskwood governance, recognizing that his daughter's years as Luna of the Blackthorn territory had given her genuine political skill that the pack could benefit from, whatever the circumstances that had brought her home. Elena found unexpected satisfaction in the work, mediating a boundary dispute between two Duskwood farming families with the same careful diplomacy she had once used to smooth tensions at Blackthorn court, advising her father on trade negotiations with skill, that surprised even herself, given how disconnected she had felt from any sense of purpose during her final months at Blackthorn. The pregnancy progressed steadily under the care of Nora, the Duskwood pack healer, a warm and steady woman who had delivered dozens of pups over her decades of service, and who took a particular interest in Elena's case, given the rare nature of carrying twins. Nora monitored Elena closely as the weeks passed, and though she offered careful reassurance at every appointment, she also made clear that a twin birth would require extra vigilance when the time finally came. "Your body is doing remarkable work," Nora told her during one examination. "Carrying 2 lives at once is no small thing, even for a strong wolf like yourself. But I want you resting more than you have been. Let your father and mother handle the pack matters that can wait. Save your strength for what matters most right now." Elena took the advice more seriously than she might have during her earlier months at Blackthorn, when constant vigilance against political threats had made rest feel like a luxury she could not afford. Here, surrounded by people who genuinely wanted her well-being, rather than simply her cooperation, she allowed herself to slow down, to spend quiet afternoons in the gardens where she had played as a child, to rebuild the kind of peace within herself that she suspected she would need in full measure once her children finally arrived. News from Blackthorn continued reaching Duskwood through various channels, carried by traders and messenger wolves who moved between territories on ordinary business, and Elena followed the unfolding situation with a complicated mixture of feelings she was still learning to name. She heard about the tension with Ironvale and the other rival packs testing Blackthorn borders. She heard whispers about growing dissatisfaction among Damien's own council regarding his handling of the crisis. She heard too, though the source of this particular rumor was harder to verify, that Seraphine's influence at court had continued growing even as the political situation deteriorated, a detail that troubled Elena less than she might have expected months earlier, now that she had found her own footing far away from that toxic dynamic entirely. She thought of Damien often, despite her best efforts not to. Not with the raw heartbreak that had defined the weeks immediately following her departure, but with a quieter, more complicated grief for what their marriage might have been under different circumstances, for the children who would grow up without their father, unless something changed dramatically in how Damien chose to handle the situation he had created. She wondered sometimes whether he thought of her at all beyond the political inconvenience her departure had caused, or whether Seraphine's influence had already fully replaced whatever affection had once existed between herself and her husband. Her labor began on a cold morning, nearly 8 months after she had first overheard that fateful conversation in the West Tower, arriving earlier than expected, but not dangerously so, according to Nora's careful assessment once she arrived at Elena's chambers. What followed was a long and difficult labor, twin births rarely being simple even under the best circumstances, and Elena's mother remained at her side throughout every hour of it, holding her hand, and offering the kind of steady, unwavering presence that Elena had needed so desperately during the darkest moments of her final months at Blackthorn, and had never quite received. The twins arrived just before sunset, a boy first, followed closely by his sister, both crying loudly with the particular strength that Nora assured Elena, once the initial chaos of the birth settled, was an excellent sign of their health and vitality. But it was not their strong cries that caused the room to fall into astonished silence once Nora had cleaned and swaddled them both. It was their eyes. Both twins, when they finally opened their eyes to blink at the unfamiliar world around them, revealed irises of a pale, striking silver, a color so rare that Nora, despite decades of experience delivering pups across the region, had only ever heard of it in old stories, never witnessed it firsthand. "The silver eyes," Nora said quietly, her voice carrying a note of genuine awe. "This is the mark of the original Blackthorn bloodline, my lady. The old stories say it surfaces only rarely, once every few generations, and always in children whose claim to the bloodline runs true and strong. Your children carry an unmistakable mark of their heritage." Elena, exhausted but deeply moved as she held her son and daughter for the first time, understood immediately the significance of what Nora was telling her. Whatever political challenges Damien's council had worried about regarding succession, whatever doubts rival packs might try to raise about the legitimacy or strength of the Blackthorn heirs, given the unusual circumstances of their birth away from their father's court, the Silver Eyes settled the matter beyond any possible dispute. Her children were unmistakably, undeniably the rightful heirs of the Blackthorn bloodline, marked by nature itself in a way no political maneuvering could challenge or erase. Word of the twins' birth, and of their remarkable silver eyes, spread quickly through Duskwood territory and beyond, carried by the same networks of traders and messengers who had kept Elena informed of events at Blackthorn throughout her months away. Alpha Edmund, holding his grandchildren for the first time, with an expression of fierce pride that Elena had rarely seen him wear, even during his most significant political victories, declared a formal celebration to mark their birth, inviting representatives from allied territories to witness and acknowledge the newest generation of a bloodline that spanned both Duskwood and Blackthorn heritage. Elena named her children carefully, choosing names that honored both sides of their heritage, without leaning too heavily toward the Blackthorn legacy that had caused her so much pain. Her son she named Kellen, a name with deep roots in the Voss family line, strong and simple, and entirely her own choice, free from any influence Damien might have tried to exert had he been present for the decision. Her daughter she named Wren, delicate but resilient, much like the small birds that filled the Duskwood forests each spring, a name that felt entirely fitting for a girl who had already proven, simply by surviving a difficult twin birth and arriving into the world marked with such a rare and powerful sign, that she carried remarkable strength within her. As the weeks following the birth passed, Elena watched her position within Duskwood territory transform in ways she had not fully anticipated. She was no longer simply the pack's returned daughter, seeking refuge from a failed marriage. She was now the mother of 2 children whose bloodline carried real political weight across the entire northern region, and her father, recognizing this shift, began involving her more directly in decisions about how Duskwood should navigate its relationship with Blackthorn going forward, given the undeniable fact that his grandchildren were also the rightful heirs to a throne currently occupied by a king who had, by every account reaching Duskwood, badly mishandled the situation that led to their birth away from his own court. Elena found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, feeling genuinely powerful rather than simply surviving circumstances beyond her control. She had walked away from a marriage that diminished her, built a new life through her own strength and the support of a family who valued her completely, and brought 2 remarkable children into the world who carried undeniable proof of their legitimate claim to a significant political legacy. Whatever happened next, whatever Damien chose to do once he learned of his children's birth and the mark they carried, Elena understood that she was no longer the same woman who had fled Blackthorn Castle in the dead of night, uncertain and heartbroken. She was someone stronger now, someone who had rebuilt herself from the wreckage of betrayal into something far more formidable than she had ever been, as Damien's Luna. The formal celebration her father held drew notable attention from surrounding territories, including, Elena learned later, quiet observers sent by several packs curious to verify the rumors about the twins' remarkable eyes for themselves. Among the various messages of congratulation and acknowledgement that arrived at Duskwood in the following weeks was one that Elena had not expected, though some part of her had known it would eventually come. A letter, sealed with the Blackthorn crest, addressed to her in Damien's familiar handwriting, requesting, with what read as genuine humility, rather than the entitled demand she might have expected months earlier, the opportunity to meet his children, and to speak with her, whenever and wherever she might be willing to allow it. Before Damien could send that letter, however, a great deal had to happen at Blackthorn Court, events that Elena would only learn the full details of much later, pieced together from what Ronan eventually told her, and what her own contacts had managed to gather in the months since her departure. The turning point came nearly 3 months after Elena left, when Ronan finally brought his accumulated evidence regarding Seraphine's manipulations directly to Damien, having spent weeks carefully documenting patterns that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence or misunderstanding. He chose his moment carefully, catching Damien alone in his study late one evening, when the king seemed more open than usual to difficult conversation, worn down by months of mounting political pressure and the persistent, gnawing guilt he had never quite managed to suppress since Elena's departure. "My king," Ronan began, "I need to share something with you that I have hesitated to bring forward, out of respect for matters I know are painful, but I believe continued silence would serve you far worse than the discomfort of hearing this now." Damien looked up from the reports he had been reviewing, something in Ronan's careful tone immediately capturing his full attention. "Speak plainly, Ronan. You have served me long enough to have earned that right." What followed was a difficult conversation that stretched long into the night, as Ronan laid out, piece by careful piece, Everything he had observed and gathered regarding Seraphine's calculated cultivation of influence at court, both before and after General Ashgrove's death. He spoke of the relationships she had built with council members long before circumstances freed her to pursue Damien openly. He spoke of the conversation he had overheard in the corridor, where she had counseled Damien to prioritize securing his children's bloodline claim over actually reconciling with their mother, advice that conveniently served Seraphine's own continued position at court, regardless of the outcome. He spoke, finally, of quiet inquiries he had made among the staff who had served General Ashgrove during his marriage, learning that the general himself had confided to close friends, before his death, that his wife's heart had never fully belonged to their marriage, that she had spoken, more than once, of regrets regarding choices made years earlier under family pressure. Damien listened to all of it in a silence that grew heavier with each new detail, his expression shifting from disbelief to something closer to dawning horror, as the full picture Ronan presented began to align uncomfortably well with his own recent memories and observations. Details he realized now he had noticed himself, but had been too consumed by guilt and old affection to properly examine. "You believe she has been manipulating the entire situation," Damien said finally, his voice quiet but tight, with barely controlled emotion. "From the very beginning." "I believe," Ronan said carefully, "that grief is genuine, but that grief alone does not explain everything I have observed. I believe Seraphine saw an opportunity in circumstances she did not create, and that she has worked very deliberately since then to ensure that opportunity did not slip away from her again, regardless of the cost to your marriage, to the Luna, or to the stability of this pack." Damien sat in silence for a long time after Ronan finished, staring at nothing in particular, and when he finally spoke again, his voice carried a rawness that Ronan had rarely heard from his king in all the years he had served him. "I let myself believe things I wanted to believe," Damien said quietly. "I told myself Elena was imagining problems that did not exist, when the truth is that I was the one refusing to see clearly. I let old feelings I thought I had buried resurface at exactly the wrong moment, and I let those feelings cloud every decision I made afterward, even as I told my own wife she was being unreasonable for noticing what was right in front of her." The admission, once made, seemed to open something in Damien that had been sealed shut for months. Over the following days, he began quietly reassessing every interaction he had had with Seraphine since her return to court, viewing them now through a lens that made her careful, patient manipulation increasingly obvious once he allowed himself to actually see it, rather than filtering everything through guilt and old affection. He confronted her directly, nearly a week later, calling her to his study, under the pretense of discussing ongoing council matters, and instead, laying out, calmly but with unmistakable finality, everything he had come to understand. Seraphine's composure, so carefully maintained throughout every previous interaction Damien could remember, finally cracked under the weight of his direct accusations. She did not deny everything outright, though she attempted, at first, to frame her actions as simply doing what was necessary to secure a place for herself after losing her husband, a woman alone in the world, doing what she needed to survive. But as Damien pressed further, citing specific conversations and specific advice she had given him during the crisis following Elena's departure, her careful explanations began to fray at the edges, revealing something colder and more calculating beneath the grieving widow persona she had maintained so effectively for months. "You would have come to me eventually regardless," Seraphine finally said, her voice losing its practiced warmth, taking on an edge Damien had never heard from her before. "We were meant to be together long before your father forced that arrangement with the Voss pack. I simply helped circumstances align the way they always should have. By manipulating my grief, my guilt, and my marriage," Damien said, his voice cold with a fury he had rarely needed to summon in his role as king. "By encouraging me to prioritize securing bloodline claims over actually reconciling with the mother of my children, you did not help circumstances align, Seraphine. You engineered the destruction of my family for your own benefit, and you did it skillfully enough that I nearly let you succeed." The confrontation ended with Damien formally revoking Seraphine's position at court, stripping her of the advisory role he had granted her, and making clear, in front of the full council the following morning, that her presence within Blackthorn territory going forward would be limited to whatever ordinary status any widow of a fallen warrior might expect, without the special access and influence she had cultivated so carefully over the preceding months. Seraphine left court within days of the announcement, her departure carrying none of the dramatic confrontation some council members had perhaps expected, but leaving behind a court that finally understood, in full clarity, exactly what had happened during the months of Elena's absence. For Damien, severing ties with Seraphine brought a strange kind of clarity, though it did nothing to erase the damage already done. He understood now, fully and without the fog of guilt and old affection clouding his judgment, that he had failed Elena profoundly, not simply through the appearance of impropriety with Seraphine, but through the deeper failure of dismissing her concerns, gaslighting her instincts, and prioritizing his own comfort with denial over his responsibility to be honest with the woman he had vowed to build a life alongside. He spent long hours in the weeks that followed, reflecting on everything that had led to this point, on the childhood affection for Seraphine that had never fully faded despite years of marriage to Elena, on the way General Ashgrove's death had reopened old feelings he should have recognized as dangerous and addressed directly, rather than allowing them to fester in secret. He thought about Elena's strength in recognizing the danger and removing herself and her children from it, rather than remaining trapped in a marriage that had stopped serving her well-being long before she finally chose to leave. News of the twins' birth reached him during this period of difficult self-reflection, carried by the same networks of information that moved constantly between the Northern Territories, and the news of their remarkable silver eyes, the unmistakable mark of legitimate Blackthorn heritage, struck him with a force he had not fully anticipated. He had children now, a son and a daughter, born into the world without him present, carrying proof of a heritage he had nearly squandered through his own weakness and poor judgment. It was Elder Mira, in the end, who finally convinced him to take the step he had been hesitating over for weeks, uncertain whether he deserved the chance to seek reconciliation after everything that had happened. "You cannot undo what has already occurred," Elder Mira told him, during a private conversation in her chambers, her ancient eyes carrying the wisdom of decades spent observing the patterns of pack politics and personal failure alike. "But you can choose, now, what kind of father and what kind of king you intend to be going forward. Elena deserves honesty from you, whatever she chooses to do with it. Your children deserve the chance to know their father, if you are willing to earn that chance properly this time, rather than simply demanding it through the authority of your crown." That evening, Damien sat down and wrote the letter that would eventually reach Elena at Duskwood, choosing his words with far more care than he had used in any communication during the months of their estrangement, acknowledging his failures directly rather than hiding behind political language or wounded pride, and asking, with genuine humility, for the chance to meet his children and speak honestly with the woman he had failed so completely. Elena held Damien's letter for a long time before she finally opened it, sitting alone in the small sitting room adjoining her chambers, the twins sleeping peacefully in the nursery down the hall, under the watchful care of Nora and a young Duskwood nursemaid named Bryony, who had quickly become indispensable to the household. She recognized his handwriting immediately, and something complicated twisted in her chest at the sight of it, a tangle of old affection, lingering hurt, and cautious curiosity about what he might have to say after months of silence. When she finally broke the seal and read the letter, she found herself surprised by its contents. She had expected, if she was honest with herself, either continued denial or the kind of entitled demand a king might make regarding his rightful heirs, an assumption that his position and authority entitled him to simply reclaim what he considered his. Instead, she found something far more humble, an acknowledgement of failure, written in language that felt genuine, rather than politically calculated, an admission that he had allowed old feelings for Seraphine to cloud his judgment, that he had dismissed and gaslighted her legitimate concerns, rather than addressing them honestly, and that he understood, fully, why she had chosen to leave. He did not demand her return. He did not demand immediate access to his children as though it were owed to him by right of bloodline alone. He asked, simply, for the opportunity to meet them, and to speak with her honestly about everything that had happened, acknowledging that whatever she decided going forward, whether reconciliation or permanent separation, would be her choice to make, not his to dictate. Elena sat with the letter for several days before responding, discussing it carefully with her mother and father, weighing the genuine hurt she still carried against the possibility that Damien had truly begun to understand and take responsibility for his failures. Her father, predictably protective, urged caution, reminding her that words on paper were easy to craft convincingly, and that Damien's true character would only be revealed through his actions going forward, not through a single well-written letter, however sincere it appeared. "I am not naive, father," Elena told him, during one of these conversations, sitting in the garden where she had spent so many quiet hours since her arrival at Duskwood, Kellen sleeping against her shoulder, while Wren dozed in a basket nearby. "I do not intend to simply forgive everything and return to how things were. But I also do not intend to deny my children the chance to know their father, if he is genuinely willing to become someone worthy of that role. I need to see for myself whether the man who wrote this letter is real, or whether it is simply another performance." She wrote back to Damien eventually, her own letter carefully worded, agreeing to a meeting but establishing clear terms from the outset. He would come to Duskwood territory, not summon her back to Blackthorn. The meeting would take place on neutral ground near the border, with her father's guards present alongside whatever escort Damien chose to bring, ensuring she retained full control over the circumstances rather than placing herself back under his authority by returning to his court. And she made clear, in language that left no room for misunderstanding, that this meeting was an opportunity for him to demonstrate genuine change, not a first step toward automatically resuming their marriage, as though the past months had not happened. Damien agreed to every condition without argument, a response that Elena noted with cautious approval, understanding that a man still clinging to entitled assumptions about his authority as king would likely have pushed back against terms that placed him in a position of humility rather than command. He arrived at the agreed meeting point 3 weeks later, traveling with a small escort that included Ronan, whose loyal presence Elena found reassuring, given everything she had eventually learned about his role in exposing Seraphine's manipulations. The meeting took place in a clearing near the border between Duskwood and Blackthorn territories, a neutral space chosen carefully by both sides, with representatives from each pack present to witness whatever unfolded. Elena arrived with her parents, along with Freya and Marisol, and with Nora, carrying Wren, while Bryony carried Kellen, the twins bundled warmly against the cool afternoon air, both now several months old and beginning to show the particular alertness and curiosity that Nora assured Elena marked healthy, thriving pups. Damien's reaction upon seeing his children for the first time was not the composed, careful expression Elena had grown accustomed to during their years of marriage. He stood frozen for a long moment, staring at the 2 infants being carried toward him, and when Nora finally brought Wren close enough for him to see her clearly, Elena watched something break open in his expression, an emotion so raw and unguarded that it startled her, given how carefully he had always maintained his composure, even during their most intimate moments together as husband and wife. "May I?" he asked quietly, his voice unsteady in a way Elena had never heard from him before. "May I hold her?" Elena hesitated only a moment before nodding, and Nora carefully transferred Wren into Damien's arms, showing him how to properly support her small head, with the patience of a healer who had guided many new parents through this exact moment. Damien held his daughter as though she might shatter if he moved too quickly, staring down into her small face with an expression of wonder that gradually shifted into something closer to grief, the grief of a man realizing how much he had already missed, and how close he had come to missing everything that mattered most. "Her eyes," he said softly, staring down at the pale silver irises that marked her as unmistakably his. "They said in the letters, but I did not truly understand until now. They carry the mark of the true Blackthorn bloodline," Elena said quietly, watching him carefully. "Both of them. Nora says, it has not appeared this strongly in generations." Damien looked up from his daughter's face to meet Elena's eyes directly, and for the first time since she had overheard that conversation in the West Tower so many months earlier, she saw something in his expression that looked entirely genuine, stripped of any political calculation or careful performance. "I am so sorry, Elena," he said. "For all of it. For not listening when you tried to tell me something was wrong. For letting old feelings I should have recognized and addressed years ago instead fester until they nearly destroyed everything that actually mattered. For every moment, I made you doubt your own instincts when you were right to trust them completely." Elena felt the careful composure she had maintained throughout the journey to this meeting begin to waver, old hurt and cautious hope tangling together in a way that made speaking difficult for a moment. When she finally found her voice, it came out steadier than she expected. "Words are easy, Damien. I have heard beautiful words from you before, and I believed them, and they turned out to mean very little when circumstances tested them. If you truly want to be part of these children's lives, and part of mine, you will need to show me that this apology means something different than every reassurance you offered me before I left." "I understand," Damien said, and there was no defensiveness in his voice, only a quiet acceptance that Elena recognized as genuinely different from the man who had once dismissed her concerns so easily. "I do not expect you to simply forgive everything, because I have finally admitted my failures. I only ask for the chance to prove, over time, through actions rather than words alone, that I am capable of becoming someone worthy of your trust again, and worthy of being the father these children deserve." The weeks following that first meeting brought a careful, gradual rebuilding of trust that neither Elena nor Damien rushed, both understanding that whatever future they might build together, whether as reconciled partners or simply as co-parents committed to raising their children well, despite living separately, would need to be built on honesty, rather than the comfortable illusions that had allowed their marriage to deteriorate so badly in the first place. Damien began traveling to Duskwood regularly, always announcing his visits in advance, rather than assuming he could simply arrive whenever convenient for him, always respecting the boundaries Elena set regarding how much time he spent with the twins, and how much interaction he had with Elena herself, beyond matters directly concerning their children. He proved, gradually, that Ronan's confidence in his king's genuine capacity for change was not misplaced, showing up consistently, engaging honestly when Elena challenged him about past failures, rather than growing defensive or retreating into political deflection, and slowly demonstrating through sustained action exactly the kind of reliability that words alone could never have proven. He also, Elena learned through careful inquiry and through Ronan's occasional updates, worked to repair the damage Seraphine's influence had caused within his own council and territory. He formally addressed the court regarding what had happened, taking full responsibility for his own failures, rather than simply blaming Seraphine's manipulations, understanding that his own weakness and poor judgment had allowed the situation to develop as badly as it had, regardless of how skillfully Seraphine had exploited that weakness. The transparency of this reckoning, delivered publicly before the full Blackthorn Council and court, went a long way toward rebuilding the confidence that had been badly shaken by months of political instability and uncertainty about the crown's succession. He also worked, with genuine diligence, to address the border tensions that had developed with rival pacts during the crisis, engaging in careful diplomacy that gradually restored the stability the region had enjoyed before Elena's departure destabilized it. Elena watched these efforts from a distance, gathering reports through her father's network of contacts, and found herself, despite everything, feeling a cautious respect for the way Damien handled the aftermath of his own failures, taking genuine responsibility, rather than simply hoping the crisis would fade with time. 6 months after that first meeting near the border, with the twins now old enough to recognize their father's face and reach for him with delighted grins whenever he visited, Elena found herself reaching a decision she had been considering carefully for weeks. She invited Damien to a private conversation, without the formal terms and careful boundaries that had structured their previous interactions, wanting to discuss, honestly and without pretense, what future she was actually willing to consider with him. They met in the same garden where Elena had spent so many quiet hours during her recovery from the heartbreak of their separation, sitting together on a stone bench while the twins played nearby under Bryony's watchful care, and Elena spoke plainly about what she needed, if any reconciliation was going to be possible between them. "I will not return to being the woman who quietly accepted being pushed aside," she told him, her voice steady and clear. "If we are to build something together again, it cannot be the marriage we had before. I need to be included fully in matters of the pack, not simply consulted after decisions have already been made. I need honesty from you, always, even when honesty is difficult or uncomfortable. And I need to know that if old feelings or old temptations ever resurface again, you will address them directly and honestly, rather than allowing them to fester into another crisis." Damien listened to every word without interrupting, and when she finished, he nodded slowly, his expression solemn but steady. "I accept every condition, Elena, not because I am simply telling you what you want to hear, but because I have spent the past several months coming to understand exactly why those conditions matter, and exactly how badly I failed you by not offering them from the very beginning of our marriage. I do not deserve automatic forgiveness for what happened." I only hope that continued honesty and continued effort can eventually earn back the trust I broke so badly." Elena studied his face for a long moment, searching for any trace of the careful performance she had once mistaken for genuine affection, and finding instead something that felt, for the first time in a very long while, entirely authentic. "I am willing to try," she said finally. "Not because everything is forgiven, and not because I have forgotten what happened, but because I believe, watching you these past months, that you have genuinely changed, and because our children deserve the chance to grow up with both their parents present, if we can build something healthy and honest between us." The reconciliation that followed was not the fairy tale reunion that court gossip and popular stories often imagined for situations like theirs. It was careful, deliberate, and built gradually over the following months, as Elena slowly returned to Blackthorn territory, though on terms very different from those that had defined her original marriage. She retained close ties to Duskwood, visiting regularly and maintaining the relationships she had rebuilt with her parents and the pack that had given her sanctuary when she needed it most. She insisted on and received full inclusion in matters of Blackthorn governance, her voice carrying genuine weight in council discussions rather than the decorative presence she had once been reduced to during the final months before her departure. Damien, for his part, continued the pattern of transparency and accountability he had established during their separation, never again allowing old feelings or unaddressed tensions to fester in secret the way his lingering affection for Seraphine once had. When difficult moments arose, and they did arise, as they inevitably do, in any relationship rebuilding itself from serious betrayal, he addressed them directly and honestly, understanding that the trust he had broken could only be rebuilt through consistent, sustained effort, rather than grand gestures or empty promises. A year after Elena had first walked out of Blackthorn Castle in the dead of night, carrying the twins who would grow to become the undeniable heirs of a bloodline strengthened rather than diminished by the trials their mother had endured to protect them, the Blackthorn court held a formal ceremony recognizing Kellen and Wren as the official heirs to the crown, their silver eyes shining in the candlelight as their parents stood together, not as the same couple who had once nearly destroyed everything through denial and dismissed concerns, but as two people who had rebuilt something stronger through honesty, accountability, and the fierce, unwavering strength Elena had discovered within herself during the months she spent standing entirely on her own. Seraphine Ashgrove, by that point, had settled quietly into a modest life far from Blackthorn territory, her attempt to reclaim old feelings and old opportunities having ultimately cost her the position and influence she had worked so carefully to cultivate. Whatever regrets she carried about how her scheme had unfolded remained her own private burden, a consequence of choices made in service of desires that had never truly considered the cost to anyone standing in her way. Elena, watching her children accept the formal recognition of their heritage before the assembled Blackthorn court, thought back often to that terrible night in the West Tower, to the fear and heartbreak that had defined the months following her discovery of Damien's divided heart. She thought of the moment she had chosen to walk away, rather than remain in a marriage that diminished her, and of everything she had built and rebuilt in the time since, both for herself and for the children who carried proof of a legacy no betrayal could ultimately erase. She had walked out of Blackthorn Castle carrying nothing but her own resolve, and the twin heirs growing within her, uncertain what future awaited, beyond the immediate need to protect herself and her children from a situation that had become untenable. What she found, in the months and years that followed, was a strength she had not fully known she possessed, a family that had never stopped loving and supporting her, and eventually, a partnership rebuilt not on the fragile illusions of a young marriage, but on the hard-won honesty and mutual respect that could only come from surviving genuine betrayal and choosing, deliberately and carefully, to build something better from its wreckage. The Alpha King had once let her walk away, too blinded by old feelings and easy denial to recognize what he stood to lose. But Elena Voss had never needed him to make her whole. She had walked out carrying his twin heirs, and, more importantly, carrying herself. And in doing so, she had discovered that her own strength had been enough all along to build the life she and her children deserved, with or without the crown that had once defined her entire sense of worth.